Oh, I really didn't test to see if my audio was coming through correctly. So I need to check on YouTube, I guess. Uh, okay. So, okay. So, bro, that's okay. Okay. So, bro, that's okay. Okay. So, all right. I don't know how I'm gonna get rid of the issue with my computer fan being loud, but I guess we'll deal with it. All right. So, where to start? Where to start? Um. So, originally, um, last year, I was trying to think of something better to use than points per game to value fantasy players, or something better to build our models after. So like I've been following Peter's stuff, PA Howdy. I've been following his stuff for a while now, and his models are to predict like points per game for the most part. And he was using points per game, and I'm thinking like, yeah, points per game is cool, but like it doesn't really describe how a player helped you during the season. It doesn't really do a good job of explaining the actual value that a player provided for you in the fantasy season. So I was thinking of all sorts of things of how to come up with something that would actually be able to like so you could value players or know how to value different players, and then also try to kind of figure out positional value also at the same time. So I did some research and I came across I don't know if I came across this thread at first, but I came across this article by Jeff Henderson, I believe his name is, and he broke down basically how to calculate fantasy football wins above replacement, which is exactly what I was thinking would be like perfect for or perfect for like describing or be at least better for describing how a player performed in a season in fantasy football. So he goes on through the article and he talks about how he calculates it, the theory behind it. Um, so I'm just gonna give a little bit brief explanation. So you're basically calculating the average starting lineup and then the standard deviation of the average starting lineup, because the key part of wins above replacement to calculate wins is you have to figure out any player's win percentage, or win, I guess it would be win probability. I'm not quite sure. Um, but basically, you take a player's performance each week, and you're calculating what the percentage chance they would be to beat the average team alone. So it's like player X, let's say Kamara, with um with the average player on it, like it's the average team plus Kamara instead of this the RB1 average that you normally would have. So with that in the standard deviation, there's a calculation that would get you the percentage chance that the team with Kamara would beat the average team. So that isolates Kamara's performance against the average team, and that's how it works. So you do that every week. So I can pull up what I've done so far. Um, so yeah, so this is 2021 War, and so this is the player's name. I set up this sheet so that it could be easily updatable. So before I even actually get into it, I should tell you what the settings of the league are. Um, which I hope this is big enough. I hope you can see it. But so I said it so that you can change the roster construction or change the amount of teams in your league. So I figured most teams have 12, or most leagues have 12 teams. Um, I was looking for a way to figure out how many games to include versus not include, like a minimum number of games players had to play, because otherwise, um, like you don't want players that only played one game to pop up highly, because the way it works is every week that a player misses, they get a replacement level um, value. So if a player only played one game and got like and did good, and then they had replacement level the rest of the weeks, then they would like kind of boost them. So I had to make a game minimum, and around 5 games is what I found to be um, like eyeballed it with that, of course. Just kind of saw that, oh, 5 games kind of eliminates all the bad players that didn't really play and allows for some of the better players that did get injured, but should still be accounted for. And it's like, if I did 8 games, I think that was too much of a cutoff. So I just slowly like moved it down and was just checking and looking back and forth. But yeah, five is what I think is the best. Um, I made it so that you can change the quantity and it'll update all the data. So you could be like, oh, I want my league has super flex, so you'd put 2 quarterbacks, and then it changes all the data within the sheet. So you have the little loading thing over here. But I'm gonna move it back to one, um, because I'm just demonstrating what I did. So yeah, then usually teams have 2 running backs, 2 receivers, 1 tight end, and 1 flex. Flexes are a little bit tricky, especially in Google Sheets for me to calculate. So I just left it at 1 for now. In later versions, I'll probably make I'll make this, up to 2 or 3 flexes you can make. But I've never been in a league with multiple flexes, which is why I kind of haven't prioritized that. But it's real simple. So this is the league settings, right? These are the number of starters, right, at each position. So the top 12 in total fantasy points are the startable quarterbacks. Um, Top 24 are the startable running backs. You have the RB1 and the RB2. Top 24 are the startable receivers, because you have 2 receiver slots. There's 12 teams. And so on. So that's like the format. But I was going over how it's like scored, to start. So this is Cooper Kupp, right? Um, so if I go back to this is where all the data is inputted, right? So you put in it's weekly data, so it's like the player's name, position, the season, the week that they played in. So this is week 4 data for Colt McCoy, right? And then I kind of separated it out into receiving, pass, just so you could see. I could have easily just like not included this and just made it so that it was the total PPR points. But I figured, it would be cool, like better to be able to see it separated out like that. And you could also make alterations to the sheet. The sheet that I made, I'm gonna make public. Um, and if you wanted to do like, oh, who have the highest rush PPR wins above replacement, you could kind of do that with this. You would just have to change um, some of the formulas. But yeah, so this is weekly data, all 2021 for every team, every player. Somebody left a comment, but I don't know what that means. Um, but yeah, so this is where all the data is being drawn from. Now this is where the win probability added stat is calculated, right? So it takes their total points per game, or PPR points in that week, and then it takes, so this is the position average for that player. I'm pretty sure it's the position average of the starter. I can check that actually really quickly. So let's look at quarterbacks. Okay. Yeah, so it's a position average. So in weekly war, this right here is the win probability or win percentage against the average team, and this is how it's calculated. Let me get back to this. So it's basically just the points minus the position average of the starters. So there's 12 starters. How many points do they average in a week? So yeah, out of this 12 starting quarterbacks in your league, which is just the 12 total point leaders across the season. We're assuming that those players are being started every week because we don't have sit start data. We don't have like percent, you know what I mean? Like we don't have the percentage started data that Jeff Henderson actually has now. But yeah, so this is calculated. It's almost like a z-score in a way, where it's like just, you take the PPR points, you subtract it by the position average, and then you divide it. And I believe this is by the standard deviation. I gotta check again. Sorry, I'm not completely remembering what I did. Yeah, then you divide it by the standard deviation of the position. And then you get the win probability, or this is just divided by the standard deviation of the whole average team. G11. Okay, yeah, that's it. Right. So yeah, so you get the win probability added, and this function norm S distribution basically assumes that it's a normal distribution, and then it takes that and then turns it into a percentage. So I'm not sure how to actually phrase it, if it's like 1% added or one probability added or something like that. I'm not exactly 100% sure on the terminology. But so this is, and then it's set up so that it takes the name from here, finds the player, and in week 1, Cooper Kupp had a 62% win probability against the average team, right? And you do it for every single week, right? And then, so here is the average win percentage that he got the whole season. Now, it's set up so that every time there's a week that they don't play, it's replaced by what the replacement level player would get. So in order to calculate replacement level, I did it slightly different than Jeff Henderson, because the way he did it was by averaging the top 12, or the next top 12 starters at the position that weren't, or the next 12, like what it would be, bench players or replacement players that weren't included in the starters, if that makes sense. So like that weren't, for running backs, for example, the top 24 in total points are considered the starting running backs. So all the other running backs each week who was the top 12 and then averaging that, right? And a good example of that is how I did flex. I actually did the flex ranking how he would have did it. So these are all the top players in week 1 that weren't considered a top 12 tight end, weren't considered a top 24 running back or a top 24 receiver, right? So you see you have the 12. See, every once in a while there'll be 13, like over here there's 13, and that's only because there's 2 players with the same amount of points, right? So they're kind of tied. So the way the function is set up, it does that. But it's not the end of the world. It still gives you a pretty accurate average of replacement level for flex, right? This is just for flex players. So you can see the flex is 10.76 averaged for the replacement level flex, right? Now, to find the replacement level of all these other positions, I originally started by doing the same method as the flex, but the way it was coming up super wonky, and I don't know how to explain it. It was essentially making the averages too high because there would be a lot of receivers that were outside of the top 24 that would totally boost, that would have really good games and then boost the average up way too high, and it wouldn't make any sense for them to be part of the average for replacement level, because it was just boosting everything up. It was making the replacement level for all the positions like too high, that it didn't make theoretical sense, right? So the way I combated that is I simplified it a ton. All I did was, who's the quarterback 13? They're the replacement level, right? So who's the quarterback 13 and what's their points per game? So I believe it was Jameis Winston was the quarterback 13, and it just pulled his points per game. And, it was simple as that, right? So and then this formula sees, who's 13th? It then takes their points per game. And did that for every position, right? So, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Yeah. So, according to the weekly war, so after I calculated replacement level, I put it in. I basically was able to calculate what the replacement level player on average would get each week, in terms of win probability, right? So anytime a player didn't play, they get the replacement level at their position for this instead, okay? And then to combat the fact that every player has one bye week, within the average, I had to subtract the replacement level once, because it would just input the replacement level every time there was a bye week, and in order, literally all I had to do was just subtract it before I did the average. So that's what I did. And yeah, so these are the top players in win percentage right here. You can see Josh Allen was 55% in win percentage, while Devontae Adams was 57%, but in WAR, Josh Allen is a little bit higher still. So now to get into the calculation of actual the wins that they get, is you just have to multiply this by 16 games, right? Because if they're not playing a game, then I just chalked it up as replacement level, right? And no player that played 5 or less games is included in this. So yeah, so you multiply this win percentage by 16, and then you get the amount of wins that they added in total, right? So then you do the same thing. You figure out how many replacement wins you would get from a replacement player over the course of the whole season, right? So you multiply their the replacement level win probability times 16, and for wide receiver you get 7.26 wins added, right? So now it's simple as this. In order to get wins above replacement, all you have to do is subtract this number, the amount of wins that the player adds, minus the replacement level wins added, and then you get WAR, and that's how you calculate the wins above replacement. And it's definitely a way better stat for actually seeing what a player did in a season versus just looking at points per game. And this actually shows you how much they helped if you would have the player on your team for the whole season, or even if you wanted to see like, how much WAR did they have through the last 8 games or so, you could do that. But for my purposes, I'm not going to. But yeah. So once I figured that out, I was able to just, this is an editable sheet. So you can go in and change what year you want to look at if you have the weekly data, right? So if you go here and you just delete all of this and then put in, let's say 2020's data, you can get an updated WAR for 2020, right? And you can do it for every season. So I set it up more, it's kind of more so for myself because I could easily update this data. The average person might not be able to, unless they have some sort of data source that gives them weekly fantasy output. But yeah. So after I did that, so this is just a bunch of calculations on how I figured out who's starting. It's a bunch of boring stuff. You don't have to really know how I did that. So this over here is where we get to the fun part, right? In these settings, Josh Allen provided 2 wins above replacement, which doesn't seem right. Did I change? Yeah, it should be fine. Hold on, let me just check something. Josh Allen. WAR 2. Okay. Yeah, that's correct. I just for some reason I remembered it being a different number. But yeah, so this is where it gets a little interesting, right? Because you can compare positions in this way, where you can see how much WAR the best player at that position offered. Then the second quarterback in WAR is Tom Brady. Third is Herbert. But you can kind of see tiers of form. So, this past season in 2021, Josh Allen was way above all the other quarterbacks in WAR. Tom Brady, Herbert, and Mahomes were around the same tier, I would say. Mahomes being a little bit like 0.20 less. Now, this is kind of difficult to conceptualize. Like, what does this mean? What am I looking at? Like, we know WAR is kind of like a good metric to describe what a player did in the season, but like to conceptualize what 0.5 WAR difference here between Josh Allen and Tom Brady is, like, that's so hard to think. Like, what does that mean? So I actually created something that would help us look at it easier because we understand the context of points per game a lot easier. So if you were to convert the wins above replacement to points per game, this is what it would look like. It's as simple as just changing, using the z-score and standard deviation and average of both, and you can literally convert a statistic into another one, basically. I don't know what that's called, or if that's like technically what you like statistically sound, but it's how I did it in terms of transferring it over to a different scale. So here you can see Josh Allen actually, his WAR points per game was 25, but Tom Brady's WAR points per game was 22. So you can think of it, oh, that's like a 3-point difference. Oh, and then so you would say, I guess Tom Brady was on his own tier in the second tier, and then Herbert, Mahomes were on their own tier, and then you could say, I guess Kyler, Hurts, Rodgers were kind of close, and tier it out that way. But this is like, again, don't think of this as something that's predictive. That's something that is gonna, like, oh, because Josh Allen was the number one quarterback, he's gonna be the number one quarterback again. That's not the case. What's more so the case though is like that these position ranks, like the quarterback one is probably gonna offer this much, like close to this much amount of value every year. The quarterback two, same thing. The distribution between each player, at each position is going to be relatively the same, no matter what year you look at. And if you wanted to see like a more clear picture, I made this chart over here. So on this axis there's a position rank, and then on this axis there's the points per game WAR, right? So yellow appears like Cooper Kupp. Then you go down, like these are the top 5. This section right here is top 5 at each position. As you can see, Josh Allen is right here. Quarterbacks and tight ends, are in the top 5, are technically less valuable than running backs, wide receivers, right? And I would say running backs and receivers are actually like kind of flush with each other, which was kind of news to some people, that the two are actually really close in value. When you look at the top 5 receivers and the top 5 running backs, it's not that big of a difference. So like the whole, if you look at ADP data, which I started to do more of, and I'll probably do another video on this later or tomorrow. When you look at ADP data, it'll tell you that like running backs are being drafted way too much in the first early rounds, right? Because it'll practically be the whole first and second round will be running backs, when it doesn't make any sense for the distribution of WAR that you're given. Like, not every running back is going to be in this top section, right? But it's almost as if people are drafting them as if they are going to be in the top section, when they're not taking into account that the fact that a lot of those picks are going to be wrong. Kind of same with receiver, but it's okay because you can get receivers a little bit later. So like any top receiver that you take, you're actually taking at a value, is what I noticed, because you're picking the guys that have the highest chance to finish at the top of the position at wide receiver. So versus taking the guys that have a higher chance of being at the top at running back. But at the same time, you can still, like, since not a lot are being drafted, you're able to get them at a later, or a lower cost, right? So you're getting like the same exact upside, if not more, because receivers tend to be slightly more predictable. You're getting slightly more upside by getting a receiver early. It's just like as simple as that. People are overvaluing, overvaluing their ability to pick out top running backs, because of the ADP shows that. The ADP shows that people are just drafting running backs like crazy in the first 3 rounds, and it just doesn't make any sense. But yeah, when you do that, you're basically punting your chance to get a high scoring player at a different position, which again doesn't make sense. But yeah, so back to this chart. You can see though that as quarterbacks goes on, tight ends across the board are kind of just like under, like there's not many good tight ends at all. It's like the top 10 or so are solid, and then it kind of just teeters off. They're not actually giving you that much value in terms of WAR points per game. Like Mark Andrews is giving you similar value to, I guess, the third receiver. But I'm not sure why this isn't. Is this not based off of this? Like, what the hell? I don't know what is going on here. Because really, if Mark Andrews is 24 and this, then it should match up with. It should be closer to whatever the. That's why I'm confused here. Why this chart is not showing that. Oh, okay, yeah, it is. It is showing it. It's correct. So, Mark Andrews right here, and then like the third receiver is like here. So like you can see that they're very close. Um. So yeah. So where was I? Oh yeah. So I was gonna talk about how, at quarterback, people overvalue, like, cause they say, oh, take quarterbacks late, but people actually overvalue the fact that, in points per game, quarterbacks actually are. It's kind of like a flatter distribution. Like the lower scoring quarterbacks tend to average close to what kind of the top quarterbacks score. Um, but that's kind of not giving you the full picture because points per game, like I said, is kind of flawed metric in it of itself. Um, when you use WAR, um, you can clearly see, top 12 or so are pretty solid, and then boom, it just dips off, and then after that, like it's a quarterback wasteland. Um, and I want to show you WAR points per game versus points per game at the quarterback position. This is also illustrates it pretty well. Um, you can see this is the actual points per game that quarterbacks score by their position rank, and then this is the WAR points per game. Um, so you can see how at the top, like the difference between WAR value and points per game value is closer. Like it's closer. Then all of a sudden here, over here, it's a little bit like a bigger of a valley, bigger difference than it is up here, right? So what this is telling us is that, points per game, if you were to just go off of points per game, is making us overvalue all these quarterbacks, right? And it's making us overvalue even these quarterbacks, these mid-tier quarterbacks from the 5 to 10 range. It's making us overvalue them too based on their points per game. When really only at the top is like the best, and then it dips off a little bit, and then all of a sudden falls off a cliff. And you could say, oh well, maybe that's just 2021. No, it's like this in every year. Um, so yeah, that kind of like busts that myth of like, oh well, quarterbacks they all score similarly. It's not true. It's just a fallacy. That's not true at all. You can see it here in WAR points per game. They understand it shows that instead of it going from a 20 points per game difference to a 19, when you convert it over to WAR points per game, it's showing you that these guys are. Let's start over here. Like you can even see the difference, across the board. WAR points per game values them a little bit lower. And then like boom, right here, this is a value of 4 points per game, right? And it just gets even worse. Like this is a value of 5 points per game, 5 points per game, 5 points per game. So if anybody tells you like, oh, quarterbacks are deep, they're not telling you the truth. They're looking at this, but not this. This matters a lot more than this. because this is actually representative of how much quarterbacks actually help you win the season. Versus points per game is flawed because you could have like you could have like 3 or 4 40-point games and then have like 3 or 4 like 5-point games, and it's just like the the average is not the best. You know, um, that's probably not the best way to explain that, but the way that you come up to that get to the average over the course of the 16 games or how many games they play, um, is not is actually making this look a lot flatter than it should look based off of your value that you're getting. Okay, now with that out of the way, we want to see kind of, if you're interested about the other positions, what they look like. Tight end, right? You've got across the board, tight ends and WAR points per game are valued more than if you were to just look at points per game. Across the board, right? With the biggest difference being the tight end one. There's a 6-point difference right there between the tight end one and WAR points per game and then tight end one in regular points per game. So like you can see how it's like how this is actually how much they actually help you win games based off of like the replacement level player at that position. And then this is just their points. So yeah, the top tight ends are definitely worth it, and people are undervaluing them because they're just looking at the points per game, right? So this is really insightful. Like every tight end, because of the scarcity of the position, is a little bit more valuable in WAR than they are in regular points per game. So this levels out the playing field. It makes it so that all positions, are relatively gonna be WAR points per game. They're all scoring on the same system almost. It levels the playing field as to like who actually has value, who doesn't. Um, but yeah, if you look at running back. Running back is actually, the points per game is actually is pretty close to the actual WAR points per game. The difference here, 28 to 23, is pretty big. Like this one's a little bit weird because it's like there's little peaks here and there randomly. Almost seems like. I'm not sure why. It's just kind of like the randomness of it. But if you look at this every year, pretty much the same distribution over here. Eckler, like look at the difference there. So yeah. What this is telling us though is that with all ADP thoughts out of the way, if we're just looking at points per game, we're undervaluing top running backs because they are scarce. But I think a bigger takeaway too is at wide receiver. Now this was interesting to me because I'm thinking, oh, just like everybody else, is that like, oh, wide receiver is deep. You can get a wide receiver late and be fine. Not exactly the case, right? And here's why. This isn't using ADP data. This is just looking at points per game versus WAR points per game. And WAR points per game, Cup is still around 5 to 6 points per game higher than the actual points per game, right? So right off the bat, there's a difference there, and you can see within the top 8 or so receivers, there's a difference there. And then something interesting happens is the lines cross. Now in the other positions they don't really cross, but this crosses. So like 10 to 10 to 20 even, um, points per game and WAR points per game are actually about even. So if you were to value those receivers by their points per game, you're actually doing it right. Um, those you're actually that's actually like right about value. Um, Now the more you go towards the lower position ranks, the more points per game is actually overvaluing. So this is where um people are like, oh, wide receivers are deep because of this points per game in the later position ranks. But actually, WAR actually shows that you know the value actually is starting to go down while the points per game is staying a little bit more steady. Um, so that's kind of a little takeaway too because um as it's not as big of a gap between the two as the other positions. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of what my first kind of like thoughts on like how the positions vary in value. I did a bunch of other cool little stuff here. Like I looked at consistency based on WAR every week, and it's like negligible. Like it doesn't matter that much. All positions at all levels are basically all the same consistency level. Um, I'd take it with a grain of salt. Like tight ends, I guess, and quarterbacks are the most consistent, but at the same time, it's like so small of a difference that it doesn't really matter. Um, I thought that was something that was gonna stand out, but it wasn't. Um, and yeah, I think that's the main takeaways from this. Um, yeah, and here I actually went and showed the difference between the points per game and WAR points per game. Um, so this is WAR points per game minus points per game. And just kind of to show you who's overvalued by points per game and who's undervalued. Um, so here, tight ends are actually undervalued by points per game a lot. You could see that the difference is pretty high between the top tight ends and WAR points per game and um, the top tight ends and regular points per game. Same thing kind of is true with wide receivers and running backs. Um, Same is kind of true with quarterbacks, except the difference. This is what was stumping me a little bit is the difference, I guess, wasn't there as it wasn't as high. This is kind of a weird way to visualize the difference. Like it's hard to interpret it just by looking at this chart what you're actually looking at. So that's kind of my bad. Um, but yeah, I think I touched on everything that I kind of picked up on from my research of wins above replacement. Um, the next time I'll dive into ADP more and how you can kind of find inefficiencies within ADP based off of like where the WAR distributions lie on like with different positions. Um, because of course you can think about it right off the bat. How many running backs get drafted, and then how many actually end up producing. Um, and then wide receivers, there's not nearly as many that get drafted in like the first as there are running backs. So, and then think about that too, like, and I dove into a whole bunch of things, and yeah, I hope this was useful or helpful in any sort of way. Um, I guess leave a comment if you have any questions, or you could DM me on Twitter at cplant underscore. And yeah, I'm also active on PA Howdy's Discord. I should probably make my own, I guess. Um, but yeah, it's been real. Um, yeah, I think this is kind of the start of like something really interesting. Um, and like kind of rethinking the way we view players based off of like these war values. Um, yeah, I think it's really important that is kind of we take the step towards understanding more so what a player brings to our team based off of their position and what we expect for them in the season. Uh, but yeah, again, hope this was useful, and thanks for watching.